Social media is ablaze with images of once bustling West Coast ports that now lie eerily silent. A few cruise ships bob aimlessly in the background, while commenters dare skeptics to visit the docks themselves. And what's next? A retail apocalypse. Store shelves picked clean, supply chains frozen, and society teetering on collapse. Is social media actually telling the truth for once? Are U.S. ports really sitting empty? And are we just weeks away from throwing hands in the supermarkets over the last roll of toilet paper? It turns out things might get ugly. This script was written prior to reversal of tariffs. However, given that reversal is temporary and relations are volatile, we think it's important our audience understands what the effects of tariffs could be if reversed and what their effects are in general. In simple terms, tariffs are taxes placed on imported goods, and they're a key tool in what's called protectionist policy. Countries often use them to shield domestic industries from global competitors that might be more efficient, more advanced, or simply cheaper. By making imported goods more expensive, tariffs encourage consumers to buy homegrown alternatives. This approach can be especially useful for developing nations that are trying to build up their own industrial sectors. On their own, these emerging industries often can't compete with established multinational firms, which benefit from better technology, economies of scale, and global supply chains. Tariffs aren't just about economics. They can also be powerful political tools. Governments use them to apply pressure on specific countries and influence international negotiations. Right now, the United States is using tariffs more aggressively than ever, applying them broadly across global markets in an effort to secure more favorable trade terms, even in cases where existing agreements already benefit the U.S. With a war in the immediate future, the White House is purposefully levying heavy tariffs on China. This is to encourage U.S. companies to move production and supply chains to other nations, ensuring American trade even in the face of war. The tariff itself is a fee imposed by the government on the import of any goods and services from target countries. This fee is paid by the importer, not the exporter, meaning that the company importing goods subject to tariffs has to pay the tariff fee. So when an American company imports glass bottles from China to use in its hot sauce, it's the American company, not the Chinese provider, who pays the tariff. The Chinese producer already got their money. These imported goods sit in warehouses until the importer either pays the tariff fee or can move them to what's known as a bonded warehouse, a warehouse where the trade authorities allow goods to be stored long-term without incurring custom duties. Importers will usually use bonded warehouses to weather out short-term economic disputes. When it comes to the tariff itself, importers have two decisions. They can either cover the full or partial cost of the tariff themselves, cutting into their profits, or pass it on to the consumer. Big importers can usually weather tariff storms by simply absorbing part or all of the cost themselves, keeping prices stable for their consumers. But America is made up of both big, medium, and small businesses, and this is what makes tariffs especially devastating for the U.S. economy. To explain why, let's look at the story of two different importers. The first is a hard-working upper-middle-class American entrepreneur. He's built a small business from the ground up, importing specialized equipment and rare ingredients to serve a niche market. His margins are thin and every dollar counts. The second is a massive corporate retailer with thousands of stores and operations around the globe. When tariffs hit, this corporation can absorb the costs, using profits from overseas branches to shield its U.S. consumers from price hikes. Business continues as usual. Meanwhile, the small importer has no buffer and loses his business. But things couldn't get that bad, could they? Yes, they could. And even worse. Politicians love to spit out lines like, "Small businesses are the cornerstone of the American economy." But they aren't lying. Small businesses employ just under half of the entire American workforce, or 61.6 million people, and they make up 43.5% of the nation's GDP. There's 33.2 million small businesses in the United States, making up a whopping 99.9% of all businesses. In January 2024, 25 to 35% of a small business's cost was inventory. 1 year later, this cost is set to explode. But how is all this going to affect global shipping and the overall American economy? First, it's important to note that despite what's being spread online, American ports are not empty. A lot of this panic stems from a sudden wave of amateur commentators discovering public vessel tracking apps. When you pair that with selectively framed photos and viral memes, it's easy for misinformation to take hold. That said, the situation is serious, and it's not just hype. While ports aren't sitting idle, the problems building behind the scenes could lead to real long-term disruption. Not all tariffs are created equal. Different countries got hit with different rates. but one stands out above the rest: China, which was slammed with a staggering 145% tariff. And that is not just a headline, it's a global shockwave. The US leans heavily on China for imports, so targeting it with such an extreme tariff isn't just reshuffling shipping routes, it is upending the entire trade ecosystem. The US-China trade war began back in 2018. This was prompted by a variety of factors, including the claims of unfair trade practices. What was a fact, though, was that China engages heavily in the theft of intellectual property, and this was another key driver for the start of the trade war. China has long engaged in industrial espionage in order to bolster its own growing industry and shortcut through the various hurdles its developing industrial sector faced. In 2012, Huawei engaged in a campaign to steal a T-Mobile robot known as Tappy. The robot is specially designed to test handheld devices like smartphones, and it is so secretive that T-Mobile doesn't allow photography of it. The robot simulates the actions a real human user will take over the lifetime of a phone, data that T-Mobile can sell to producers in order to improve the quality of their products. Huawei would be found guilty by a US court and ordered to pay nearly $5 million in damages. In 2018, a Chinese spy was arrested for trying to steal engine technology information from GE. He was discovered to be a career intelligence officer who became Deputy Division Director at China's Ministry of State Security and working to steal trade secrets from the US and Europe. At the time, Chinese aviation firms were struggling to develop homegrown aircraft capable of competing with the Western giants, so they partnered with companies like GE to build planes domestically. But with state backing, China used these partnerships to extract trade secrets, all in a bid to eventually shut out foreign competitors from the massive Chinese market. Later, US presidents would add tariffs on things like electric vehicles and solar panels. These would fall under the column of protectionist measures, as the Chinese government heavily subsidizes its electric vehicle industry in a bid to become a global leader. Not only does the government subsidize the production costs of EVs, but it also provides subsidies to individuals buying Chinese EVs. Thus, the protectionist tariffs were not just meant to keep American manufacturers competitive in the home market, but also to punish China for creating a predatory environment in the global EV industry. However, in April 2025, the new administration ratcheted the trade war up to 11. After an initial proposal of a 60% tariff on Chinese goods, the admin ramped up the final figure to a 145% tariff. China would immediately respond by imposing a 125% tariff on American goods, with China later commenting that there was no need to impose higher tariffs. At 125%, the Chinese market was already rejecting American goods. But then, in early 2025, both sides agreed to a 90-day easing period. The US dropped its tariffs to 30% and China lowered its own to just 10%, offering a brief moment of relief amid mounting tensions. But when it comes to an escalating trade war, the entire world is a loser. The place to watch for the impact of tariffs is America's West Coast ports, which have been dubbed Ground Zero for the global trade war. The Port of Los Angeles and the Port of Long Beach are America's two most important ports, which together form the largest port complex in the entire United States. They process just under half of all U.S. imports, with a significant amount of these coming from China. For weeks after the start of America's world tariff war, traffic remained normal for U.S. ports, confusing many. However, the important part to remember about global trade is that it runs behind current politics. It can take about 2 weeks for a container ship to cross the Pacific from China, and even longer if it's headed around Africa to the East Coast. But more to the point, and one of the reasons why you've yet to feel a significant effect of tariffs on prices is because of a concept known as front-loading. As the political climate deteriorates, importers will usually take note and, in anticipation of things like tariffs or trade disruptions, will invest in front-loading shipments. Thus, an importer that has a large enough pool of capital will purchase extra inventory to hold in warehouses in anticipation of tariffs. This happened across the United States import sector, with major importers holding as much inventory as they had space to physically store. In January of 2025, if you had a big, secure, empty warehouse, you stood to make a lot of money from importers desperate to find space for their front-loaded inventory. This kept U.S. ports busy even as the world edged ever closer to a massive trade war, with no indication to the layperson that a major shipping disruption was imminent. The Port of Los Angeles is set to see container volume down by 1/3 in the second week of May compared to the same amount of traffic just a year ago. Meanwhile, the ports of Seattle and Tacoma expect container imports to decline by 40% in May. In the Port of Long Beach, 34 dockings have already been canceled by shipping companies for May and June. All of this is an indicator of a massive drop in supply for many of the goods that Americans use every day. But let's talk about jobs. In 2022, 7% of America's workers were directly tied to the movement of goods across the country, while 15% were employed by supply chain-related industries such as warehouses. This means that everything from longshoremen to truckers to security guards at warehouses, all of which are facing a serious drop in work hours and possibly even the loss of their jobs. And a lot of jobs are set to be lost. The Port of Los Angeles and Long Beach complex are expected to lose up to 1/3 of its container traffic in May alone. That is not just a shipping problem, it's a jobs problem. For every 4 shipping container, there is typically 1 American job tied to it, whether it's on the docks, behind the wheel of a truck, in a warehouse, or stocking store shelves. According to the Port of LA officials, traffic could drop anywhere between 15% and 45%. That translates to thousands of jobs at risk. Workers have already been told that overtime is off the table and reduced hours are now the norm, part of a last-ditch effort to avoid mass layoffs. But even if jobs are spared, paychecks are getting lighter. American importers have already announced a complete freeze in hiring and, just as importantly, capital investments. It's hard to tell which is worse, a freeze on job expansion or a freeze in investments. Without capital investments, the U.S. economy cannot grow, which means that every month of frozen investments is thousands of future jobs which will not be created. Russia is learning firsthand what happens when the investment tap runs dry. Following the mass pullout of Western businesses and the ongoing sanctions, the country is facing a capital collapse that shows no signs of reversing. Without a significant policy shift or the sudden lifting of sanctions, most experts believe Russia could lose its status as a globally competitive economy within 2 decades. Much of the harm has already been done, and the lack of capital threatens to turn Russia into a global gas station, which offers little else of value to the world economy. A similar freeze is endangering America's own future economy and an economic engine which just months ago was reaching record highs and has effectively sputtered to a stop. Adding to global shipping confusion, China is scrambling to relocate goods outside of the country. In a bid to avoid the steep American tariffs, Chinese exporters are either physically moving inventory to neighbors like South Korea, Vietnam, or Thailand, or simply falsifying the paperwork to make it appear as if shipments are originating from non-Chinese ports. In the case of the former, Chinese exporters are arguing that their goods undergo a transformative process in the new country they're being shipped to, such as when a manufacturer ships unfinished goods to another country for assembly before finally exporting them to their market destination. In this case, there's a good case for relabeling a country of origin. However, this is blatantly not the case for many Chinese goods, with exporters simply seeking to avoid American tariffs. Both falsifying of shipment records or relabeling of goods in third world countries had already been taking place before even the current trade war. But the practice has exploded since the U.S. tariffs took effect. This has had a direct impact on shipping, as the global supply of shipping vessels is finite, adding costs to the shipping industry overall due to vessel inability. But it also slows down logistics at third country ports as authorities crack down on the illegal practice. The end result is more wasted time for ships needed to move goods around the world. So, are U.S. ports going to go empty during this trade war? The short answer is no. It would be practically impossible for that to happen. No matter how bad tariffs get, the truth is that there are some goods that are impossible to replace. That's either because they can only be manufactured in places with really high tariffs, or because major businesses can offset part of the cost, thereby keeping the price low enough to still be economically viable. Profits from non-American markets, where goods aren't subject to extreme tariffs, can also offset these costs. But small business owners who rely on imports are increasingly finding themselves in situations they never dreamt of. Flexport CEO Ryan Peterson recently called the tariffs an asteroid coming to destroy America's businesses, and warned that 80% of small businesses who relied on Chinese imports could face bankruptcy. The University of Pennsylvania's Penn-Wharton Budget Model, or PWBM, a nonpartisan initiative that provides economic analysis of public policy, discovered that the tariffs will reduce the nation's GDP by 6% and wages by 5%. Over the course of a lifetime, the average middle-class household will face a loss of $22,000. But as the PWBM warned, these findings only include known data. Tariffs shrink economic activity globally, and thus the full range of lost opportunities and lost economic activity is simply impossible to know. Do you think the tariffs are helping or hurting the U.S. economy? What do you think the long-term impact will be on global trade? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Now go check out Tariff that destroyed the American economy in just weeks, or click on this video instead.